The Warborn lords had once been the rulers of humanity's greatest empire, warriors bred for battle, conquerors who had carved their dominion from the bones of alien civilizations. But time and treachery had done what no enemy could. Their kingdom was in ruins. Their numbers were a fraction of what they once were, and now, on the fortress world of Varnus, they prepared for the final war. Lord General Darius Kane stood at the central war table, his cold eyes scanning the incoming reports. Red warnings flashed across the holographic interface. Enemy fleets breaching high orbit, orbital defenses engaging, planetary shield integrity holding at 70%. For now. "They come in force," said Marshal Idris Varric, his second in command. A hardened veteran, Varric had survived more wars than most men had years of life. His face was a roadmap of old scars, each a story of battle. 122 war fleets, representing over a dozen species. This is no show of power. This is extermination. Kane exhaled slowly, watching as the enemy formations took shape. "They fear what we were," he said, "and they fear what we might become again." For centuries, the Warborn lords had ruled through strength alone. There was no diplomacy, no compromise, only victory and annihilation. The alien species of the Orion Expanse had learned to fear the Warborn, their genetically enhanced warriors, their battle-hardened strategies. But empires were not brought down by war. They were brought down by weakness, by betrayal from within. The Great Betrayal had come 20 years ago. Humanity's lesser factions, those who had always resented Warborn rule, had allied with the alien races they once fought. The Warborn lords were labeled as tyrants, their empire dismantled, their armies disbanded. Those who survived fled to Varnus, the last of the strongholds. Now, the galaxy had come to finish what they started. A proximity alarm blared. "Orbital bombardments commencing," a tactician reported. "Shields holding, but the enemy is testing our defenses. The first wave will land within the hour." Kane turned away from the war table and looked out of the great war room's steel glass windows. Beyond them, Varnus' sky was ablaze with fire. The great planetary shields shimmered under the relentless barrage, absorbing the impact of high-yield plasma detonations. Even from here, he could see the massive war machines of the enemy assembling in low orbit. Legions of towering mechanized walkers, swarms of alien shock troops waiting to be unleashed on his world. He clenched his fists. The Warborn lords had never been defeated in battle. If this was to be their end, they would make sure the enemy paid for it in oceans of blood. "Bring the artillery bastions online," Kane ordered. "I want the enemy landing zones turned to slag before their first troops touch the ground." The war room buzzed with activity as officers relayed his commands. Across Varnus, the last of the Warborn prepared for war. Titan-class cannons emerged from fortified citadels, locking onto enemy drop zones. Warborn infantry, clad in ancient power armor, took position in the trench networks that lined the capital's outskirts. In the deep vaults below the surface, experimental warbeasts and cybernetic soldiers, long thought too dangerous to unleash, were awakened from stasis. Varric stepped beside Kane, watching the unfolding battle. "Do we have a plan?" Kane smirked. "We do." Varric raised an eyebrow. "A real plan?" Kane's expression hardened. "Kill them all." The sky cracked open as the first wave of invaders fell upon Varnus, and the Warborn lords prepared to meet them in the only way they knew how, with fire, steel, and blood. The first wave hit like a storm. Drop pods, burning like meteors, tore through the Varnus sky, slamming into the ashen plains surrounding the capital. Within seconds, the battlefield erupted into chaos as thousands of enemy soldiers poured from the wreckage, their armored forms surging forward like a tide. The Warborn were waiting. Artillery bastions, buried deep within the mountains, roared to life. Superheated tungsten slugs, the size of vehicles, ripped through the atmosphere, pulverizing enemy drop zones before their forces could even spread out. Shockwaves tore apart entire platoons in an instant. Craters bloomed across the battlefield, swallowing invaders whole. Despite the carnage, the alien coalition pressed forward. The vanguard consisted of the Zdar Clawborn, towering, multi-limbed monstrosities bred for close combat. Their armored carapaces could withstand most small arms fire, and their natural weapons could cut through Warborn power armor like paper. Behind them came the Taveri Storm Guard, humanoid energy wielders whose bodies crackled with plasma, their hands casting arcs of destruction across the trenches. And behind them, marching in endless formation, were the Drexian Iron Legions, the foot soldiers of the coalition, mass-produced and disposable, but numbering in the tens of millions. Lord General Kane stood atop a fortified bastion, watching as the enemy charged forward. The sky flashed with orbital fire, and the battlefield below was a shifting landscape of destruction. His officers relayed reports, casualty numbers, shifting enemy formations, impact points. None of it changed his next command. Engage. The trenches erupted with gunfire. Warborn infantry, clad in ancient battleplate, unleashed a wall of death upon the enemy ranks. Hypervelocity rounds punched through alien armor, reducing flesh and bone to mist. Grenades and thermal charges turned advancing formations into burning wreckage. Warborn sharpshooters, stationed in the ruins of old citadels, targeted enemy commanders with mechanical precision. And then the melee began. The Clawborn reached the trenches first, leaping into the fortified lines with terrifying speed. Blades and claws met Warborn steel as the two forces collided. Kane watched as his warriors fought like demons, outnumbered but never outmatched. One Warborn knight, his armor dented and covered in blood, locked swords with a Clawborn warrior 3 times his size, dodging a swipe before driving his blade through its skull. Another Warborn, missing an arm, used his remaining strength to detonate a plasma charge, taking a dozen invaders with him. For every Warborn that fell, 10 enemies died in their place. Yet still, the enemy pressed forward. Kane turned to his second-in-command. Deploy the Gorgons. Marshal Varric hesitated. They aren't fully tested. Neither are the enemy's gods, Kane growled. Deploy them. From beneath the capital's walls, massive armored doors slid open. A deep mechanical growl echoed across the battlefield as the Gorgons emerged. Titanic Warborn mechs, relics of an age when humanity ruled without question. Each one was a walking fortress, bristling with weapons, piloted by Warborn lords who had fused themselves with their machines to become immortal warriors. The Gorgons entered the fray, and the battle turned. Their chain guns roared, spitting storms of tungsten rounds that shredded entire battalions. Plasma cutters melted through the Clawborn as if they were wax figures. The towering mechs stomped forward, crushing enemy formations beneath their feet, tearing through the coalition ranks with ruthless precision. The enemy wavered. For the first time, hesitation spread through the invaders. Then the sky darkened. An unnatural hum vibrated through the air, followed by a sound like glass shattering across reality itself. A new force descended from the heavens, the Seraphim Dominion. They did not land in dropships. They simply appeared. Towering figures of energy and light, their bodies barely restrained within shimmering battle plate, drifted onto the battlefield. Their psionic presence alone sent Warborn soldiers staggering. Their mere existence bent the laws of physics, making the air ripple around them. At their center floated High Warden Solus, the most powerful psionic in the known galaxy. His gaze fell upon the Warborn lines, and he raised a single hand. The battlefield exploded. Warborn trenches erupted as unseen forces ripped through them. Soldiers were lifted into the air, their armor crumpling as if crushed by an invisible fist. Gorgons seized up mid-stride, their pilots screaming as their minds were invaded by a force beyond comprehension. Entire regiments were erased in an instant, their bodies imploding under the sheer weight of Solus' presence. Kane barely had time to react before the High Warden's voice echoed across the battlefield, a whisper that rang in the minds of every soldier. You are relics of a dead age. Your time is over. Kane clenched his fists, stepping forward onto the battlements, his mind racing. The Warborn had faced monsters before, They had fought gods before, and gods could bleed. He turned to his officers. Prepare the next phase. I want every available asset focused on taking down Solus. Varric looked at him. That might cost us everything. Kane's eyes burned with defiance. Then it will be a worthy trade. The Warborn had held the line. But now, the real battle was about to begin. The battlefield was a graveyard of fire and ruin. Warborn bodies, clad in broken battle plate, lay in craters and trenches, torn apart by psionic forces beyond human comprehension. What had once been a ruthless defense had become a slaughter. The Seraphim Dominion had arrived, and with them, High Warden Solus, the greatest psionic entity in the known galaxy. Kane stood atop the western bastion, his breath slow and measured as he surveyed the carnage below. His mind, trained through decades of war, calculated the odds, and for the first time in years, he saw only one path forward. They had to strike now. Marshal Varric, Kane said, his voice cold as steel. We cannot hold this position if Solus is allowed to tear through our lines uncontested. Varric wiped the blood from his brow, eyes narrowing as he watched Seraphim warriors float above the battlefield, their presence alone twisting reality. Agreed. What's the play? Kane turned toward the central command deck. We take the fight to them, deploy the Reapers, ready our infiltration teams, and signal the Eclipse fleet. Tell them it's time. Varric raised an eyebrow. The Eclipse fleet? That's a suicide run. Kane allowed himself a grim smile. Exactly. The Reaper drop. Deep beneath the Citadel, in a forgotten vault where the last remnants of ancient Warborn technology lay dormant, the Reapers awoke. There were only 50 of them left. 50 warriors, the last of an elite order that had once been the scourge of the stars. Their armor, darker than the void, absorbed light rather than reflected it. Neural uplinks connected them directly to the battlefield, allowing them to react before their enemies could even blink. Unlike the Warborn knights in the trenches, the Reapers were something else entirely. Assassins, shadows, death incarnate. The vault doors slid open. Kane stood before them, a living legend among legends, his presence commanding absolute silence. You know your mission, he said. Solus and his Seraphim believe they are untouchable. Make them bleed. No one spoke. They simply moved. The Reapers strode into drop pods, their weapons humming with quiet lethality. In seconds, the launch base fired, and the assassins hurtled toward the battlefield below. The sky lit up as the Reapers fell like meteors. The Seraphim barely had time to react. The moment the first Reaper touched the ground, the slaughter began. Blades of pure energy cut through the air, slicing through Seraphim warriors before they could unleash their psionic fury. Suppressor rounds, designed to disrupt neural pathways, found their marks, severing Seraphim connections to the immaterial forces they wielded. The Reapers moved like ghosts, appearing and vanishing in the blink of an eye, tearing through the enemy ranks with terrifying efficiency. Solus turned his head slightly, sensing the shift. His burning gaze landed on one of the Reapers, a warrior who had just driven a blade through the throat of a Seraphim lord. The High Warden simply gestured. The Reaper exploded mid-stride, his body crushed into nothingness by an invisible force. But more came. Too many. For the first time, Solus frowned. The Eclipse fleet's last stand. High above, the Eclipse fleet arrived. It was a ragged, beaten force. What little remained of the Warborn armada. Once, these ships had ruled the stars. Now, they were ghosts barely holding together. And yet, here they were, emerging from the darkness like avenging specters. The Coalition's orbital command was taken completely off guard. They're insane, a Taveri admiral hissed, watching as the Warborn ships plunged directly into the heart of the Coalition fleet. They're outnumbered 100 to 1, but numbers meant nothing to the Warborn. The Eclipse fleet detonated their first wave of charges, hyperspace fragmentation bombs designed to tear subspace itself. Enemy ships were ripped apart before they could react, entire formations collapsing into chaos. Warborn dreadnoughts, already ablaze, rammed into alien battleships, turning the void into a fiery graveyard. Kamikaze runs. Desperation. A final strike to buy time. From the surface, Kane watched as the heavens burned. He knew what this meant. Every soldier aboard those ships had accepted their fate before launching. They had no intention of returning. But their sacrifice was not in vain. Kane's gamut. Back on the surface, Solas lifted his hand again, preparing to unleash another psionic shockwave that would end the Warborn Reapers once and for all. That was when Kane struck. He had moved through the battle unnoticed, flanked by the best warriors he had left. Their target was clear, Solas himself. Kane's blade, forged in the dying embers of 1,000 battles, came down like a falling star. The High Warden turned, raising his hand to stop it. Too late. The blade cut deep, black blood spraying across the scorched earth. Solas let out a roar that shattered reality itself, the very air around him twisting as he staggered backward. For the first time in his existence, he felt pain. The battlefield froze. The coalition forces, the Warborn, even the Seraphim, all turned toward the impossible sight. Solas, the godlike being who had brought civilizations to their knees, bleeding. A low chuckle rumbled from Kane's throat. He twisted the blade deeper. Not so untouchable after all, are you? The Warborn had just done the unthinkable. They had wounded a god. And now, the real war would begin. Solas' scream tore across the battlefield, not just through sound, but through the very fabric of existence. The air rippled like water, shockwaves ripping apart the ground, sending Warborn and coalition soldiers alike tumbling. Kane gritted his teeth, his muscles straining as he pulled his blade free, black ichor dripping from its edge. He had done it. He had wounded a god. For a single, breathless moment, the battlefield stood frozen. Warborn warriors, bloody but unbowed, gazed upon the impossible sight. High Warden Solas, the unshakable, the invincible, clutching his side in pain. The Seraphim, those celestial warriors who had always hovered above mortal struggles, faltered, their psionic auras flickering with uncertainty. Even the coalition's forces hesitated, their belief in their divine weapons suddenly shaken. Then Solas moved. With a furious, unseen force, he hurled Kane backward. The Warborn Lord was sent flying, his armored form slamming through the wreckage of a fallen Gorgon mech. Metal groaned and shattered as he crashed through it, finally skidding to a halt on the blood-soaked ground. His vision blurred, pain lancing through his body, but he forced himself to rise. Solas floated above the battlefield, his piercing eyes burning with an emotion none had ever seen before. Rage. You dare, the High Warden's voice boomed, reverberating inside the skulls of every living being on Varnus. His wound began to close, the black ichor evaporating into nothingness. His hands clenched into fists, and the very sky darkened. Kane wiped blood from his lips and spat. I dare. A storm of psionic energy erupted from Solas, a swirling maelstrom of raw power. Warborn warriors were lifted into the air, their bodies convulsing as invisible hands crushed them. Trenches collapsed. Defensive bastions buckled as reality itself trembled under the weight of his wrath. But the Warborn did not cower. Marshal Varric, leading a battered but unbroken legion, raised his fist. We bleed, but we do not kneel. The Warborn roared in defiance, surging forward. Reapers danced between collapsing buildings, striking at the Seraphim with newfound precision. Gorgon mechs, battered and scorched, unleashed their remaining payloads, lighting up the battlefield with fire and shrapnel. The Eclipse fleet, what little remained of it, crashed burning into the enemy lines, their dying crews ensuring that they took as many of the coalition's forces with them as possible. The battlefield was no longer a battle, it was a cataclysm. The Warborn's last trick. Kane activated his comlink, his voice cutting through the storm. Varric, is the package ready? Locked and primed, Varric replied. You really want to use this thing? Kane's eyes never left Solas, whose storm of destruction was reaching its peak. We don't get second chances. Varric exhaled sharply. Understood. Deep beneath Varnus, in the ruins of an ancient Warborn vault, a final weapon had been prepared, a relic from a forgotten era, a reality disruptor. It had been outlawed for centuries, even by the Warborn themselves. Too unstable, too unpredictable. Unlike conventional weapons, it didn't just destroy matter, it rewrote it. And now, they were going to use it on a god. Varric relayed the command. Detonate. A deep, resonating hum pulsed through the planet. The ground beneath their feet shifted, as if the very laws of nature were reconsidering their existence. Then, it unleashed. A sphere of crackling energy expanded outward, swallowing everything in its path. The air itself fractured into shards of light and shadow. The coalition forces caught within it ceased to be, not destroyed, not vaporized, but erased. And Solas was at its center. The High Warden let out a roar of defiance, his form flickering between existence and non-existence. His divine essence strained against the weapon's reality-breaking force, resisting, pushing back. But even he could not escape unaffected. His body warped, his golden form fracturing like a shattered mirror. For the first time, the Warborn saw fear in his eyes. Solas fought to stabilize himself, but Cain was already moving. Charging through the battlefield, his armor cracked and battered, he leaped toward the High Warden one last time. His blade, still wet with the blood of a god, cut through the shifting reality, aiming for Solas' heart. The High Warden raised a trembling hand, trying to halt the inevitable. But Cain was faster. The blade struck true. A thunderous shockwave erupted as Solas let out a final, agonized scream. His form collapsed inward, his essence unraveling under the disruptor's power. The sky itself tore apart as the god's presence was violently erased from existence. And then, silence. The battlefield stilled. The Warborn, the Coalition, the Seraphim, everyone stared in stunned disbelief. The High Warden was gone. The Warborn had done the impossible. They had killed a god. But as Cain fell to his knees, the shattered ruins of Varnus burning around him, he knew their fight was not yet over. The Coalition was still vast. The Seraphim were wounded, but not broken. And the Warborn were fewer than ever before. The last kingdom of the Warborn lords still stood. But for how much longer? The battlefield was silent. Not the calm before a storm, nor the temporary pause of a ceasefire. This was the silence of disbelief, of a moment so impossible that even war itself had stopped to acknowledge it. Solas was gone. Where the High Warden had once stood, there was nothing but a seared scar upon reality, a void where existence had been forcibly rewritten. His psionic storm had vanished the instant he had, leaving behind only the echoes of his final agonized scream. The sky, which had darkened under his wrath, was now eerily clear, as if the heavens themselves were unsure of what had just transpired. Cain remained on his knees, his armor cracked and bloodied, his hand still gripping the hilt of his blade. He stared at the place where Solas had fallen, where a god had died. His breath came slow and heavy, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like the ruins of the Warborn citadel behind him. They had done it. They had killed a god. And yet, he did not rise. A faint tremor ran through the ground. Not an aftershock, not the residual energy of the disruptor. It was the weight of a million eyes turning toward him. The Coalition's armies still remained. Across the battlefield, alien warlords, Tavera generals, Drexian commanders, and the few surviving Seraphim warriors all stood frozen, processing what had just happened. Their great divine champion, the one they had built their entire campaign around, was gone. Their unstoppable force had been stopped. And then came the realization, slow at first but spreading like wildfire. The Warborn still stood. The Coalition had outnumbered them 100 to 1. They had deployed their greatest weapons, their most devastating forces, and they had still failed to crush this final, defiant kingdom. And now, The Warborn were turning their eyes toward them. Marshal Varric was the first to speak. He stepped forward, his armor streaked with blood, his blade still humming with heat from the last battle. His voice, hoarse but unbroken, rang across the battlefield. "Solas is dead," he roared. "Your god is gone, and now you stand before the Warborn. Run, or die." The effect was immediate. The Tevari were the first to break, their disciplined lines fracturing as their psionic generals, now leaderless, lost their grip over their troops. The Drexian Iron Legions, who had fought like a machine with a single will, suddenly found themselves fragmented. Even the surviving Seraphim, their once flawless forms flickering with instability, hesitated. A single moment of uncertainty. And the Warborn took it. Cain forced himself to his feet, his voice carrying across the ruins. "Charge." The Warborn surged forward. It was no longer a battle. It was a massacre. The Reapers, their numbers dwindled but their spirits unbroken, moved like phantoms through the enemy lines, cutting down commanders before they could rally their troops. Gorgon mechs, their ammunition spent, used their sheer mass to crush retreating forces beneath their titanic frames. Warborn infantry, bruised, battered, and outnumbered, fought with the fury of the gods they had just slain. The coalition forces shattered. Some fought, some fled. Many simply surrendered, dropping their weapons as fear gripped their hearts. In a single hour, the Warborn turned the tide of the war. ####, the end of an age. By nightfall, the battlefield was theirs. The coalition had been routed, its armies either dead or retreating into the void. Fires still burned in the ruins of the Warborn citadel, and the air was thick with the scent of war. But for the first time in centuries, the last kingdom still stood. Cain stood atop the shattered walls, gazing at the wreckage below. Varric approached, his steps heavy with exhaustion. "It's over," the marshal said. Cain shook his head. "No, it's just begun." Varric frowned. "The coalition is broken. The Seraphim lost their leader. The war is won." Cain turned to him, his eyes dark and unreadable. "And what happens now? The galaxy just watched a god die. Do you think the coalition will let this stand? Do you think the rest of the universe won't come for us next? The Warborn are no longer a dying people. We are a threat, and threats are destroyed." Varric was silent. Cain exhaled, looking out over his surviving warriors, the last of their kind. Fewer than ever before, a fraction of what they once were. And yet, against all odds they had endured. They had proven that gods could bleed. And now, the real war was about to begin. The fires of Varnus still smoldered, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. The bodies of the fallen lay scattered across the ruins, Warborn and coalition alike. The stench of war clung to the air, thick with the iron tang of blood and the acrid burn of shattered war machines. Cain stood at the heart of it all, the weight of victory pressing down on his shoulders. His armor was battered, streaked with the blood of men and gods alike. The sword that had slain Solas still rested in his grip, its blade now dull, the energy within it spent. The Warborn had won, but the silence that followed was not one of triumph. It was the silence of knowing that this was not the end. The reckoning. A cold wind swept across the ruins as Warborn forces began the grim work of gathering their dead. Marshal Varric oversaw the process, his face hard as he counted the cost of their victory. Out of the thousands who had once called the last kingdom home, only a few hundred warriors remained standing. The Reapers had been nearly wiped out. The Gorgon mechs, their towering forms once symbols of Warborn might, were now broken husks scattered across the battlefield. The Eclipse fleet, which had sacrificed itself to cripple the coalition's forces, was no more. And yet, despite their losses, they still stood. Varric approached Cain, his expression grim. "We need to leave this world." Cain didn't turn to face him. "And go where?" Varric exhaled sharply. "The coalition is wounded, But they won't stay that way for long. We both know it. They'll regroup. They'll come back with more ships, more warriors. And this time, they won't stop until we're dust. Kane finally looked at him, his piercing gaze unshaken. Then we don't wait for them to come back. Varric frowned. What are you suggesting? Kane turned his eyes toward the sky, where the wreckage of destroyed warships still drifted in orbit. His mind was already working, already calculating. Solas was their symbol, their invincible god. We proved that gods can die. He sheathed his sword. Now we prove that empires can fall. A galaxy in chaos. Word of Solas' death had spread faster than any fleet could travel. Across the galaxy, the news ignited fear, rebellion, and chaos. For centuries, the Seraphim Dominion had ruled as divine enforcers, their psionic might ensuring absolute obedience from every species under their control. Now, with their god slain, that control was fracturing. On the Tavari homeworld, riots erupted as citizens questioned the faith that had governed them for generations. The Drexian war clans, once bound by unshakable loyalty to the coalition, now whispered of war, not against the Warborn, but against each other. Even within the coalition's own leadership, fractures began to show. The High Council, once unified in their crusade against the Warborn, now debated in frantic desperation. Some called for immediate retaliation. Others urged caution, terrified of facing an enemy who had slain the one being they thought untouchable. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy trembled, and Kane intended to shatter it. The Warborn's next move. Inside the ruined citadel of Varnus, Kane gathered what remained of his people. The survivors stood in a great hall that had once been a place of kings and conquerors. Now it was a tomb, its once proud banners burned, its stone walls cracked. He stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "We are the last of our kind," he said. "For centuries, the galaxy has hunted us, believing us to be the dying embers of a forgotten age. They sought to wipe us out, to bury our legacy beneath the weight of their false gods." He let his gaze sweep over them, over the warriors who had given everything, yet stood ready to give more. "But we are not dead. We are not broken. We are Warborn." A murmur rippled through the hall, low at first, then growing. "The coalition will come for us," he continued. "They will send their fleets, their armies, their new champions, and they will expect us to stay here, to wait for them to strike." He shook his head. "But we will not wait. We will not kneel. We will strike first." The murmurs turned into roars of agreement. Varric stepped forward, arms crossed. "We don't have the numbers for a full-scale war. If we take this fight to them, it has to be surgical. We need to hit them where they're weakest, make every move count." Kane nodded. "We don't need to fight them head-on. We make them bleed from the inside. We shatter their alliances. We ignite rebellion in their own ranks. The galaxy thinks we're a dying kingdom." His lips curled into a cold smile. "Let's show them how wrong they are." The Warborn rebellion begins. That night, under the light of burning wreckage and a shattered sky, the Warborn planned their next move. Their first target was the Seraphim homeworld, where the Dominion's remaining leaders were gathering to select a new High Warden. Without Solas, their psionic hierarchy was fragile, too fragile. If the Warborn struck now, they could ensure that no successor would rise. At the same time, they would send their best infiltrators to the Coalition's core worlds, seeding unrest and rebellion among the countless species that had once feared them. This was no longer about survival. This was about revenge. For centuries, the Warborn had been hunted, driven to the brink of extinction. But now, with a dying empire before them, and a wounded galaxy in chaos, they had their chance. Not just to survive, not just to rebuild, but to burn their enemies to the ground. And as Kane looked to the stars, he knew one thing for certain. The war was far from over. The Warborn did not wait. They did not linger in their ruins, licking their wounds, as the galaxy expected them to. Instead, like a blade in the dark, they moved with ruthless precision, striking before their enemies could even gather their breath. The Seraphim homeworld, Ascendia, was their first target. It was a place no Warborn had ever set foot upon, a world of towering citadels built atop floating monoliths, suspended in endless skies. It was a sanctuary for the divine, the seat of power for the celestial empire. And now, it was vulnerable. With Solas gone, the remaining Seraphim were in disarray, their psionic control over their dominion weakened. The remaining High Wardens argued over succession, each vying for dominance, each desperate to restore order. Cain and his Warborn would ensure that never happened. The infiltration of Ascendia. A lone warship, one of the few Eclipse-class vessels still intact, drifted into Ascendia's orbit under the guise of a disabled Coalition cruiser. It was a bold deception, one that relied on the Seraphim being too fractured to detect the ruse in time. Inside the ship, Cain stood with his chosen strike team. Varric, a handful of elite Reapers, and the last surviving Warborn engineers. They had one mission, not to conquer, not to fight an open war, but to set the Seraphim's throne ablaze. The Seraphim still think like gods, Varric murmured as they suited up. They believe themselves untouchable, even now. Then we remind them, Cain said, locking his gauntlet in place. We've bled their strongest. Now we burn their home. As the ship drifted closer, the Warborn launched. Silent, invisible, lethal. Descending through the clouds, they moved like phantoms, landing atop one of Ascendia's floating citadels. The palace of the High Wardens stood before them, its towers gleaming with psionic energy. Cain gave a single command: burn it down. The fall of the Celestials. The Warborn struck without warning, without mercy. Explosions tore through the palace halls, shattering the golden architecture that had stood for millennia. Warborn engineers overloaded energy cores, turning the very power that sustained the citadel into a weapon against its creators. Seraphim warriors, still disoriented from Solas' death, were caught unprepared. Their psionic defenses, once thought impenetrable, collapsed under Warborn precision strikes. Cain led the charge, his blade carving through celestial warriors, their once untouchable forms flickering with instability. These beings, once worshipped as deities, now bled like mortals, their screams no different from any other dying soldier. The Warborn did not stay to fight an extended battle. This was not a siege. This was an execution. Varric's demolition teams reached the central spire, the heart of the Seraphim's power, where the new High Warden was to be chosen. They destroyed it in one calculated detonation. With a blinding flash, the spire crumbled, the energy that had once held the citadel aloft unraveling. The entire structure collapsed, its remains plummeting from the skies, vanishing into the endless abyss below. For the first time in recorded history, a celestial throne world fell. The Warborn's message. As Ascendia burned, Cain sent a transmission, not to the Coalition's leaders, not to the remnants of the Seraphim, but to the entire galaxy. A single message, broadcast across every network, every system. Your gods are dead. Your empires are crumbling. You hunted us. You tried to erase us. Now, we will erase you. The galaxy, still reeling from Solas' death, shuddered. The Warborn were no longer remnants of a dying kingdom. They were something far worse, a force that could not be stopped. The Seraphim's last breath. In the wake of Ascendia's destruction, chaos erupted across Coalition space. The Seraphim, once the glue that held the Dominion together, were leaderless, scattered. Some of their remnants flowed into exile, while others desperately sought to salvage what little remained of their rule. But with each passing day, more and more species under Coalition control began to rebel. The Tavari homeworld declared independence, emboldened by the Warborn's defiance. The Drexian war clans, sensing weakness, turned upon their former allies, plunging the Coalition into internal war. And the Warborn. They did not stop. Cain and his warriors moved from world to world, striking without warning, dismantling the coalition's infrastructure piece by piece. What had once been a galactic empire was now a scattered collection of dying rulers. The war had not ended. It had only just begun. The galaxy burned. Where once the coalition's rule had been absolute, now there was only chaos. The war that had been meant to exterminate the Warborn had instead shattered the very foundations of the empire that had sought to erase them. From the ashes of Ascendia to the war-torn ruins of Taveri strongholds, rebellions surged like wildfire. The Seraphim were gone, their divine dominion annihilated. The coalition's fleets, once unified, fractured, their warlords turning against each other in a desperate bid for power. And at the center of it all, like a storm tearing through the void, the Warborn struck again and again. But even as Cain watched his people do the impossible, even as he stood upon the bridge of the last Warborn flagship, he knew the truth. This was not victory. Not yet. The last enemy. In the dark depths of space, beyond the ruins of Ascendia, a final force still remained. The coalition had not been built by the Seraphim alone. The High Warden had always been their god, their weapon, but the true architects of the war machine had been the Exarchs. They were the unseen rulers, the shadowed oligarchs who had funded, supplied, and engineered the coalition's vast empire. They had not fought in the front lines, nor led armies into battle. Instead, they had built fortresses hidden in the void, bastions where they could rule from a distance. And now, they were the last ones left. If they were allowed to remain, the war would never end. They would retreat, regroup, and in time, build another war machine to hunt the Warborn once again. Cain would not allow that to happen. "This is our final move," he said, staring at the star chart before him. "We end it here." His warriors nodded. No one hesitated. The Warborn had come too far to leave the job unfinished. The storming of the Void Citadel, deep within a dead system, hidden behind layers of artificial storms and minefields, the Void Citadel stood as the coalition's last stronghold. Inside, the Exarchs, wealthy, powerful, once untouchable, waited, believing that time was on their side. They were wrong. The Warborn descended upon them like the reapers of legend. Cain led the assault himself, his forces breaching the station's defenses with pinpoint precision. The Exarchs, desperate, deployed their last remaining armies. Drones, mercenaries, experimental war machines. None of it mattered. The Warborn had fought against gods, against entire fleets. They had survived extermination. A dying empire's last stand would not stop them. Hall by hall, the Warborn cut their way through. Explosions ruptured the Citadel's core, fire and debris filling the corridors as Cain and Varric reached the inner sanctum. The Exarchs were waiting. A dozen figures, once untouchable rulers, now nothing more than desperate old men clinging to a lost empire. Cain stepped forward, his armor blackened from battle, his blade dripping with the blood of their last defenders. "You built this war," he said. "You hunted us. You burned our worlds. And now, you beg to be spared." One of the Exarchs stepped forward, hands shaking. "You can't kill us all. If you do this, the galaxy will never forgive you. You'll become the monsters they always feared." Cain's expression didn't change. "We already are." And with a single command, the Warborn executed the last rulers of the coalition. The war was over, a future forged in fire. The coalition was dead. Its fleets were scattered, its leaders were gone. But the galaxy was not at peace. Without the coalition's iron grip, new powers would rise. The Taveri homeworld was now a fledgling republic, its people struggling to rule themselves for the first time in centuries. The Drexian war clans had fully turned on one another, their civil war threatening to tear entire sectors apart. Other species, long oppressed, now fought to reclaim their independence. And the Warborn, they did not seek to rule. Cain stood upon the bridge of their last great warship, staring into the endless void. "We have done what we set out to do," Varric said beside him. The war is over. Kane shook his head. Wars never end. They just change. For the first time in history, the Warborn were free. No longer hunted, no longer bound to the ashes of a dying kingdom. They had carved their names into the stars with blood and steel. And now, they would decide what came next. As their fleet vanished into the void, whispers spread across the galaxy. Tales of warriors who had defied gods, broken empires, and rewritten destiny itself. Some feared them. Some worshipped them. But one truth remained. The Warborn were legend. And legends never die.